ніякого розуміння, що може трапитись така трагедія в перші дні війни, в нас не було.
That's why a lot of people didn't evacuate.
Приходом войны у всех поменялась жизнь. Все поменялось.
This is the story of Russia's assault on Mariupol, a strategic port city in southeastern Ukraine. These are the interviews, videos, photos, and 3D models that Human Rights Watch, C2 Research, and Truth Hounds used to reconstruct the struggles residents faced as Russian forces took over the city. This is Mariupol after Russian forces occupied the city. Russia's full-scale military invasion of Ukraine began on February 24, 2022, as its forces attacked Ukrainian positions defending Mariupol. The city was pounded by explosive weapons for weeks. Much of Mariupol was seriously damaged in the Russian assault. Human Rights Watch and C2 Research conducted a detailed damage assessment of the destruction. While satellite imagery shows damage to rooftops, our modeling reveals more. We used over 850 videos and photos of buildings that we found online and verified, in addition to satellite imagery to capture the extent of the devastation in the city center. Buildings with damage are seen here in red. Our analysis shows that 93% of the 477 high-rise apartment buildings in this area were damaged. Some of this imagery could help prove war crimes. Our focus was Mariupol's main avenue, Myru, or Peace Avenue, and the immediate surrounding area, the city center, which includes cultural hubs, hospitals, schools, and universities. And this is Mariupol before.
Це містечко, де жило десь 500 000 людей.
Останні роки він був розквітлий, у нас парки були нові, у нас настільки центр відбудувався.
Город становился современным, молодежным.
For Russian forces, Mariupol was a strategic prize. It would give them control of one of Ukraine's largest ports and the land corridor between occupied Crimea to the west and areas Russia had been controlling in Donbas to the northeast. As the attack on the city began, tens of thousands of civilians huddled in shelters and basements to escape Russian bombing and shelling. Many people we spoke to relocated to the city center, which they believed to be safe.
Люди в основном тоже переехали кто куда, кто в бомбоубежище, кто в подвал, кто остался в квартире сидеть. Но в квартире мы посчитали, это небезопасно, конечно. Это мы в подвале сейчас. Наше такое импровизированное бомбоубежище. Вот в таких условиях мы проживаем. С нами тут живет около 40 человек, около 15 детей. Обстрел был очень мощный с самого утра в 6. А в основном, конечно, все машины были разрушены, и стекла.
Russian forces used a variety of explosive weapons in Mariupol, including aerial bombs and ground-launched artillery, such as projectiles and rockets. The use of these weapons in populated areas is the greatest threat to civilians in contemporary armed conflicts and heightens the risk of unlawful indiscriminate attacks.
Авіаобстріл, бомба попала прямо в гуртожиток. У мене лице було просто розірвано. Рука, груди, живіт, ноги, все це було порізано.
Але для мене ця картина, бачити мертві тіла, була вже абсолютно звична. І потім нам сказали, що в той день померло 7 людей, 2 дитини і 5 дорослих.
Under the laws of war, parties have an obligation to do everything feasible to minimize harm to civilians. These are the maternity and pediatric units of a hospital that Russian forces bombed on March 9th. At least 3 people were killed, including a pregnant woman and her baby, who was stillborn after the attack. 17 people were injured. In this case, witnesses told us that there were no Ukrainian military personnel, vehicles, or installation close by at the time. A deliberate strike on a hospital not being used to carry out attacks harmful to the enemy is a war crime. Humanitarian volunteer Mikhailo Purishev was about 400 meters from the hospital by Priazovsky State Technical University.
Очень все боятся. Очень все боятся. Слышите, да? Это гремит. Это Мариуполь.
Слышу, что самолет летит. Вот. И прямо это. И я кричу, что авиация, и мы начинаем забегать.
Авиация хуярит. Пиздец, бегим. Вниз спускаемся. Все нормально? Это пиздец.
Потом, когда я вышел на улицу, уже я увидел вот, весь ужас, что случилось.
Блядь, а там что, заминировано или что там?
Нет, это авиация, походу, или что?
Бабушка. Бери, спаси. Тащи.
At least 2 people were killed on the spot. Witnesses said there were no military targets at the university. An attack that is not directed as a specific military objective is a laws of war violation and possible war crime. Numerous images posted on social media and given to us by witnesses helped us assess the damage to parts of the university campus. The fighting damaged vital infrastructure, knocking out the city's electricity grid, which in turn cut essential services.
So we're left without gas, without water, without power, so we are absolutely isolated from civilization. No internet, no update, nothing.
Если мыть руки, то только так. Значит, собираем снег, ведро закидываем, потом ставим это ведро на костер, кипятим.
Отлично. Живем как в каменном веке, в пещерах. Переместились. Во время войны еще кучеряво живем. Бекончик, макарони. А над головой летят снаряды. Главное, чтобы они из нас барбекю не сделали. The city was destroyed, and every day the city was getting destroyed more and more.
Але я можу сказати, що з кожним днем ці вибухи тільки набирали темпу. І з кожним днем було все гучніше, все більше цих вибухів та було все більш пекельніше.
We use satellite imagery, photos and videos to track damage across Mariupol. We found 86 out of 89 schools and universities were damaged, and all the city's 19 hospital campuses. The damage to these facilities devastated healthcare and education across the city.
І ми там кожного дня розуміли, коли ж можливо буде виїхати, але ми розуміли, що місто закрите і немає можливості виїхати.
In the first 2 weeks of March, multiple attempts to provide safe passage out of the city failed in the face of Russian obstruction. Arbitrary restrictions on the evacuation of civilians or the delivery of aid would amount to a violation of the laws of war and possible war crimes. In early March, hundreds of people had gathered at the Donetsk Academic Regional Drama Theater for shelter and in the hope of getting safe passage out of Mariupol. Natalia Tkachenko arrived on March 12th after an attack destroyed her home.
Там кое-как кормили, обед, похлебка, утром и вечером стакан кипятка, но это хоть что-то было по сравнению с тем, что дома не было ни воды, ни еды, ничего. Темно, света нет. Зайти в туалеты было нельзя. Воды не было, их никто не чистил, не мыл. И это был такой кошмар. И никто по театрам не ходил, бегали только дети, потому что дети есть дети, они игрались, они смеялись.
At least 500 people were sheltering at the theater on March 16. Giant Cyrillic letters spelling "children" were painted on the ground in front and at the back of the theater. These words were clearly visible on satellite imagery. Natalia was bringing water inside by the main entrance.
И в это время падает бомба. Просто ударной волной. А там все летало. Этот цемент в рот, в глаза везде. Обломки какого-то дерева, досок, стекла. И я не слышала, кроме гула. И вот этого треска ничего не слышала.
Satellite imagery, videos, and photographs of the theater show that the central part of the roof and the northern and southern walls were destroyed. At least 15 people were killed, and the total number has not been determined. Given the absence of a military target at the theater, it appears that Russian forces deliberately attack civilians, which would amount to a war crime. Those responsible for war crimes in Mariupol should be held to account. By reviewing official Russian government statements, social media posts, and obituaries of Russian soldiers, we identified 17 military units that took part in the 2022 siege of Mariupol. Considering the extent of the military operation, the highest levels of Russian command likely knew the situation in the city and were involved in the planning, execution, and coordination of the actions of the Russian and Russia-affiliated forces. Those responsible for the conduct of Russian forces during the siege of Mariupol include President Vladimir Putin, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu, and Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces Valery Gerasimov, among others. As the battle for the city raged, food and other basic supplies ran low.
Отступите чуть-чуть, пожалуйста. Вы сейчас задавите людей, пожалуйста.
Самое страшное, наверное, была не так еда, а как и тепло, да, а как медикаменты. И люди просто умирали из-за того, что этого просто не было. Больше всего людей пострадало. Вот. Это стариков и детей.
Thousands were killed in attacks. Others died from health complications due to lack of medicine and clean water.
Мариуполь — это такое большое кладбище людей. Там очень много пооставалось под завалами. Так что еще в будущем предстоит узнать, сколько людей там погибло.
We were horrified at what we saw because there were burnt multi-storied houses and bodies in the streets.
Неймовірно їх перелікувати, тому що люди настільки і під завалами залишалися, і по дорогах.
Many were buried in a makeshift trench grave in the old city's cemetery.
Це були дві великі траншеї. Повністю ми заповнили одну траншею, це біля 200 тіл.
These bodies from the trench grave and many other makeshift graves across the city were exhumed and reburied in the city's cemeteries when Russian forces took over. We estimated the minimum number of people killed by fighting or who died of poor conditions. To do so, we counted graves in two types of burial sites. In some cases, we counted individual graves visible in high-resolution satellite imagery. We also estimated the number of bodies buried in trench-type graves. We verified footage at two cemeteries, which allowed us to count the plaques, sticks with a small wooden panel, in a given area. We then used this sample size to extrapolate to other parts of the cemeteries. In 5 cemeteries in and around Mariupol, between March 2022 and February 2023, we estimated at least 10,284 new burials. We do not know how many of these people were civilians. Considering average annual death rates in Mariupol, we calculated more than 8,000 people would not have died were it not for the attack on the city. This is likely a significant underestimation of the total number of dead, as many graves contained multiple bodies and the remains of others were likely buried in the rubble and taken away during demolition efforts. With the city still under Russian occupation and much of the physical evidence destroyed, the full death toll may never be known.
Look around, what is going on, what's happening with our Mariupol. He completely destroyed, completely gone. Just disappeared. Just nothing, just ruined.
With attacks by Russian forces continuing, tens of thousands of residents found their way out of the city at great personal risk, being in mid-March.
We were hoping war suddenly will stop, and finally we realized this is not going to happen. We decided to run away. Надеемся, будет все хорошо. В общем, ужасы.
By mid-May 2022, Russian forces had full control of the city. The bombs might have stopped now, but the city's tragedy is far from over. The psychological effects of the fighting, displacement, and the losses that Mariupol's residents experienced will reverberate for years to come.
Маріуполь – це місто, яке стало пеклом.
People should know what is happening.
Тому що ми чітко розуміємо, як би нам не хотілося те наше довоєнне життя, ті наші там, наше місто, наші друзі, наші близькі, наші там, не знаю, квартири, там те, що вже ніколи не повернути.
This footage is from October 2022. Since occupying the city, Russian forces are demolishing buildings and constructing new ones. Russia is also replacing Ukrainian culture with its own. For justice to be done, the survivors of Mariupol need reparations for their losses. The loss of their homes, their loved ones, their livelihoods, and the impact on their mental health. Russian officials and military commanders credibly implicated in war crimes committed in the city need to be brought to justice.
Когда попала только на украинскую землю, первая фраза была, что этих людей надо наказать.